Good morning, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Cybersecurity Due Diligence, a Best Practice in M&A. My name is Teresa Bruner, and I'll be your host for today. First of all, I'd like to introduce our presenter, Sig Murphy, who is the Managing Director of Incident Containment and Forensics here at Cylance. Sig is responsible for overseeing all of Cylance Consulting's incident response engagements and forensic work, as well as providing support to our client executives before, during, and after a breach to ensure they are best able to handle cyber incidents. Prior to joining Cylance, Sig served as the Vice President of Services for Fidelis Cybersecurity, where he was responsible for the success of Fidelis' cybersecurity engagements. In that role, Sig served as the project lead for many high-visibility incident response matters, including the TJX intrusion, the 2016 DNC breach, and a breach at a major U.S. stock exchange. Prior to joining Fidelis, Sig served at the DoD Cybercrime Center for 12 years. And a couple of things before we hand this over to Sig, a few housekeeping items. Just to let you be aware, application widgets are at the bottom of your screen. Please submit all your questions via the questions widget that you see. We'll try to answer those questions during the webinar, but we will have a live question and answer at the very end. Your feedback is also essential, so please fill out the survey at the end of the webinar. Also be aware that this is being recorded, and links of this recording will be sent to you in the next couple of days, and will also be posted on the Cylance.com website. And if you need any help during the webinar, please contact us at webinars@cylance.com. Sig, I'm going to hand this off to you.
Great. Thank you, Teresa, and thank you all who are attending today in the audience, and those of you who are listening to this post-presentation. I really appreciate your attendance and joining us today to talk about a very important topic, which is cybersecurity as it relates to mergers and acquisitions. As Teresa mentioned, she did a great job with my background. I pretty much live and breathe incident containment and incident response work, as well as proactive measures. And some of those proactive measures we're going to talk about towards the end of our discussion today. But many of them, in an increasing fashion, we are asked to go into companies that are part of a merger or acquisition process in order to assess their cybersecurity and detect any latent threats or anything else that's present on their network or their environment. And the merger process is very unique. We are seeing more and more impact from cybersecurity matters and incidents in the mergers and acquisitions process. So for today, my goal is to have you understand the unique risks that are present in mergers and acquisitions as it relates to cybersecurity. We're going to talk about a few examples of M&As that cybersecurity impacted negatively and some of the costs that were involved there. We're going to talk about a roadmap to identify key actions and points in the M&A process that are kind of inflection points that you can apply cybersecurity assessments and other proactive measures to in order to get maximum effectiveness and to know the maximum amount about the M&A. And then we're going to also talk through key prevention strategies. So I'd like to start, before we proceed, by mentioning a podcast I was listening to yesterday. I'm kind of a personal finance buff, and that's one of my interests, and I listen to personal finance podcasts. And there was a presenter on one of my favorite podcasts who you would think is fairly well versed in personal finance. He has a blog that he's been contributing to for the last 5 years. He has a little bit of a following and has some specialty areas. And he was going over a story about how he recently got married, and he loved his bride-to-be very much. But it wasn't until after they were married that he found out that she had over $10,000 in credit card debt. She wasn't trying to hide it from him. Their love was not in question. And as a personal finance guru, people look to this gentleman to advise them in matters of personal finance, but the topic just never came up. He never talked to her before the marriage about something that he's incredibly passionate about. And that's very similar to what we encounter in the M&A process these days. There's a lot of mechanisms and things that go on prior to a merger or acquisition. And literally, during an M&A, the entities that are involved, the acquirer and the acquiree, or the target as we call them, really have to kind of, in effect, go through a marriage process. Things are generally laid bare through financial disclosures and other things that would normally not see the light of day. And eventually, the two organizations merge, including all their assets, including their computer assets. And many times, there's something hidden there, no matter what the intentions of the acquirer. A lot of times, there's a hidden threat or something that they're just not sure of because they didn't have the wherewithal to do their due diligence before that merger. And that can be very costly. It can be costly in just raw dollars to address the issue. If there's a cybersecurity latent threat to do an incident response, it can be costly. And when we discuss the acquirer's brand reputation, and we're going to see many examples of that as we go through the talk today. First, let's talk about cybersecurity in general. As we live a more and more connected life, and as we entrust entities, corporations and government entities, other entities with our data, we are at an increasingly higher and higher exposure to risk that our data may be lost or stolen. It's surprising to me that as of right now in 2018, over 5 million data records a day are lost or stolen. That equates to every single minute over 3,500 records. And we, as cybersecurity professionals, it shouldn't be as alarming, but that's a very large number. And the fact that it's happening day in and day out, hour by hour, even while folks that's records are stored in these corporations or government entities are sleeping, that's pretty alarming. So what types of information can be stored in these corporations or entities? There's payment card data, PCI, and attackers like this type of data and seek it because it's pretty easy to then translate that into dollars. They can masquerade as an individual with proper credit card information and information about that individual, and they can translate that into cashing out. They can also sell that. There's a secondary market that I'm sure many of you are aware of, where batches of stolen credit card information and PCI information are sold for pretty alarming rates of return. Then there's credentials, so just passwords and logins that attackers can utilize to masquerade as individuals on websites, on email providers, on you name it. That's very valuable as well. We've seen a massive uptick in type of specialized ransomware attack where an attacker group will actually carry out an incident response to compromise somebody's credentials, and then they will utilize those credentials to send malware to that person's contacts. They do a lot of exhaustive research, and we've actually timed this over, literally tens of cases this year already, where the attackers will spend days, if not sometimes up to a week or two, just reviewing emails so that they can act like they are the person that they've gotten the credentials from. And then they send an email attachment out that looks like it is from them to their contacts in order to infect them, and then continue the chain going down. Then there's intellectual property. This can be a number of things. The most basic forms can be music, media. It can be games, programs. It can be legal data. It can even be data that, contractual data about M&As and other things. And recently, we've seen a massive uptick in the targeting of medical records. With PCI data above, somebody can masquerade as if they are an individual for the purposes of using their payment cards and getting cash out. With medical records, people can masquerade as that individual to seek services. They can utilize that information for blackmail or other potential purposes. And what we've seen that those medical records on the dark web or on the forums where those are sold are even more valuable to the hackers than the payment card data. We talked about intellectual property and approaching that is copyrighted materials. We talked about media and other things. And then there's personally identifiable information. And one of the favorite things for attackers to do in certain circles, like political hacktivism, is to do what's called doxing somebody. So exposing a person's personal information to the internet and to other hackers. And that can be devastating to that individual. We saw a lot of that in this last election cycle. Teresa mentioned my work experience with the DNC hack. We saw everybody's familiar with that one. That's perhaps the most publicly visible instance of this, but it happens all the time, and it can be absolutely devastating to somebody, and therefore that information is valuable to attackers. In mergers and acquisitions, all of those data types that I spoke of on the last slide can be targeted and can be stolen. However, there's other types of data that maybe are subsets of some of those data types that can be even more valuable to attackers. So just like a marriage, during an M&A process, there are a lot of negotiations going on, a lot of exposure to personal information or to corporate information. Some of these are mandated through regulations, and others are just important for the negotiation process. And these pieces of data are not publicly accessible generally, and are only produced during M&As, and they can be incredibly valuable to a number of attacker sets. One subset of that is financial information. So a lot of times during the M&A process, the financials of the organization that's being acquired or the target are examined with a fine-tooth comb by the acquirer or their designees. And then the third type of information and threat is once an M&A is undertaken, either before or after a merger or acquisition, the attack surface for both the acquirer and the target can be multiplied. And we see this all the time. We're going to talk about some specific instances, but obviously we treat our clients' confidentiality as paramount here at Cylance. Just please take my word for it that on a lot of these matters that we do, incident containment or incident response matters after an attack, the root cause after investigation turns out to be basically as a result of an M&A. Many times, a target company that was acquired or merged into the acquirer years previous had latent infection or brought with it certain vulnerabilities that were utilized by the attackers to get into the acquirer. And this happens all the time. So we're going to talk about the importance of doing some proactive assessments prior to M&A. So what type of actors would be interested in attacking entities that are involved in a merger or acquisition? The answer is all kinds. So we frequently see what's called advanced persistent threat or nation-state actors that are effectuating these attacks pre-M&A as well as post-M&A. Pre-M&A, they might be working for a nation or government that was trying to or is trying to acquire the target. They might be interested, or their government they work for might be interested in acquiring similar targets in the future. And so the data that is present about the transaction is very important to them. We routinely see disgruntled employees, either on the acquirer or the target side, that are not happy about the M&A. They think that they are either being sidelined, or that a lot of times the positions will change or are eliminated. And we see a lot of times that these disgruntled employees will actually effectuate an attack. A lot of times they'll place back doors into organizations' networks, things like that. And the list goes on. We have financial criminals. We talked about some of the use cases they're interested in previously. And just generally, that M&A process can open up both parties to increased cyber attacks. So why is information security so important during an M&A? Well, for one, during the negotiation process, if information security is paramount to protect both parties' interests. There's a number of cases that we've worked on where the actual deal itself was affected by cybersecurity or poor cybersecurity. There's a liability there that if due diligence isn't followed, that can increase the possibility of these attacks we're talking about. There's the value proposition. So from an acquirer perspective, there's the fact that if the acquiree or the target is the victim of a cyber attack, their value necessarily may be affected. There's, of course, multiple legal and liability issues that information security is key in protecting and is paramount to. And as I was preparing for this slide, I have a one view as a practitioner that's been responsible for leading teams for incident containment, incident response, and proactive assessments. But I was not aware of the fiduciary duties and the legal mechanisms that must occur during these types of events. And those are huge. There's a number of case studies out there that I researched that we're going to talk about, some of them shortly, that deal with M&A specifically and what went wrong from a legal or fiduciary standpoint. Then there's just plain old risk and increased risk during these endeavors, as well as exposure to certain elements on both sides. When you connect another entity to your network, you literally can expose your environment to elements from their environment. And then there's also this long-term cost idea. We're going to talk about that towards the end of the presentation in more detail. So why is it important to do an assessment prior to executing an M&A? What we've found is that many, many, many times a target company, somebody that's being acquired, may not have the best visibility onto their assets from a cyber perspective and an information security perspective. Even some of the largest companies out there, for instance, Teresa mentioned that I did a response for a major U.S. stock exchange. There are incredible regulations involved for the stock exchanges, and they are at the pinnacle of, you would think, of the economy to the U.S. and the world. And in this particular instance, the group that we were working with as part of this event, this incident containment event, they didn't even have a great understanding of their environment and the vectors, you know, the elements that make up their environment, the computers and servers and networks, and the vectors that the bad guys could have gotten in through. So if they don't have that visibility, imagine the potential for the target or the acquiree companies that may not be as large or complex or as highly regulated as things like a stock exchange. Many, many times they don't know their entire environment. They don't know the attack surface, the potential vectors inbound by the attackers. So it's important to do assessments prior to these activities. So what could be the impact of the results of an assessment? Almost 1/4 of respondees for this merger market survey, which is kind of the major survey for M&As, said that they have walked away from a deal due to security issues. That's huge. And we've seen that very frequently. We've seen deals that have been called off due to security issues that were uncovered during these assessments. 40%, 4 out of 10, said that they found issues after the deal was consummated, after the M&A event. And these are pretty major issues in some cases. Almost half used the assessments that were performed to plan for fixes, and when the deal went through, to kind of plan for remediation and to address the issues that were uncovered. And 1/3 of them used the information that was uncovered in the assessment to decide whether to proceed with the deal. Those are the lucky ones. 20% use the evaluation as a pretext to renegotiate. And we'll see examples of that here shortly, but that can't be understated enough. So the cost of an average assessment, just spitballing, is usually well under 100K, usually under 50K, depending on the size of the environments, the complexity, other things like that. So think about some of these M&As that have occurred. You're talking hundreds of millions of dollars on the line. And if an assessment can uncover things that increase the risks that the acquirer needs to know about, and then can utilize that to go back and renegotiate, you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars could have been at play here just for an assessment. So this is a great example. So Neiman Marcus experienced a data breach in July of 2013. They were unaware of it. And it involved a semi-sophisticated attack as far as PCI attacks go. But about 350,000 customer cards their customer records were affected. There was a $6 billion acquisition in play after the attack started, but before Neiman Marcus was aware of that. So that's key here. So the acquirer in Ares Capital and the acquiree or target Neiman Marcus, neither one of them were aware of the attack during the acquisition. Sale was completed in October of 2013. And then in December of 2013, the first first evidence of attack started to point towards Neiman Marcus. And for those of you who are unaware of how that works, there is basically a procedure that's followed by the investigators for the payment card industry as well as law enforcement, and it's called a common point of purchase analysis. And so what happens in a CPP is that the credit cards where fraud is reported by either by the consumer or through law enforcement activities are analyzed, and they're put into a giant database for analysis. And the law enforcement or PCI investigators will try and identify a common point of purchase. So if these 350,000 cards all had Neiman Marcus as a common point of purchase, that would be a huge indicator that Neiman Marcus was the source of the breach. Sometimes it's not as easy as that. Sometimes due to the environment in the underground and the dark web, the attackers will wait a little bit to release their cards. Sometimes they'll do some time testing. Sometimes just because of the realities on the network, it takes them a while to get the cards out. So in this instance, the attack was not known by either party until after the merger and acquisition occurred. Would have been nice for Ares to know that prior to their $6 billion purchase, right? So Neiman Marcus had, after the purchase, had to publicly disclose that they had been breached and that 1.1 million records were taken between July and October. And they had to agree to take a settlement fund of 1.6 million to cover that. But that's not where it ends. Can you imagine being Ares on this instance where you spend $6 billion to acquire somebody, not knowing that there's a skeleton in the closet, and then you see the value of that acquisition drop significantly after that acquisition? That must have been a very uncomfortable position to be in. So then we have one of the more famous incidences, which is the YAHOO, one of the YAHOO data breaches. In this one, Verizon agreed to purchase YAHOO in July of 2016 for $4.8 billion. In August of 2016, so 1 month after that date, they announced an investigation before the deal had been consummated. So the acquisition was ongoing. And basically, they claimed that the breach had started in 2014. There's some evidence that it actually started in 2013, and there was quite an uproar about that. And they found out through investigation that, after they had come out and publicly said that it occurred in 2014, that in fact it had occurred in 2013. And the deal closed while this was all going on, and the purchase price for the deal was reduced by $350 million. So, as I mentioned earlier, the price of an assessment is infinitesimally smaller than that when you consider how much money was lost by that disclosure. I'm not saying that a compromised assessment or a pen test or one of our proactive services would have been on that scale that I mentioned earlier, but I would wager that it was definitely a lot less than $350 million worth of impact. So the last example we want to talk about here is TRIPADVISOR. And this one is very interesting because of the result, which we're going to get to here in a second. So in 2014, in July, TRIPADVISOR announced an agreement to acquire Viator. In August of that same year, the deal was finalized. And 3 weeks later, Viator learned of an ongoing attack. And they learned that the system has been breached, and credit card information, email addresses, encrypted passwords were stolen for 1.4 million customers. TRIPADVISOR, the acquirer stock dropped 4%. And so that's about $200 million worth of market value wiped off the books because of the target or the acquiree's incident that was unknown to TRIPADVISOR when they first kind of started with the M&A process and then consummated it later. So $200 million worth of value was wiped off of TRIPADVISOR's valuation. Now, what's even more important than that is that occurred in 2014, as I mentioned. TRIPADVISOR's stock has never recovered. It has never gotten back to that pre-Viator merger's pricing. So that impact cannot be understated. So how does one actually perform an M&A with cybersecurity at top of mind? So how does one perform these activities and do it the right way? The first thing to do is to identify any high-value digital assets in the acquiree or the target's environment. Most people would consider these things as intellectual property, file servers, also email servers, infrastructure, key pathways to and from their clients are very important to be identified. And then it's really important to actually analyze the effectiveness of the target's internal cybersecurity program. What do they have in place, and what's the maturity of what they have in place in order to protect their assets? So here, you're looking at people, processes, and technologies as it relates to cybersecurity. A good place to start with that is what's called the IRP, or the Incident Response Plan, which everybody should have. Hopefully your organizations do have them. Good thing to check when you go back to work here shortly. So the next thing to do is to talk through risk management as they relate to third parties. Everybody now is familiar with the Target attack. Target had fairly good cybersecurity. At a couple stops in my career, I was in communication with folks that were on the Target team, prior to the actual attacks, and they were taking a number of proactive measures in order to not be the victim of a cyber attack. I think this stuff's all become public through the disclosures post-breach, but they have their own forensic lab, which is a step well beyond most companies. What they have. They had a 24/7 manned SOC, Security Operations Command Center, that was monitoring attacks and monitoring traffic. They have a number of things that they did prior to that breach that were very good preventative measures. But what actually happened, as everybody knows these days, is that a third-party vendor, an HVAC company out in, I think, rural Pennsylvania, if I remember correctly, was attacked by the attacker set, the bad guys, and was victimized. And then their logins into the target environment were utilized to actually then effectuate the attack against the larger target as a whole. So it's really important to map out all of those areas where third parties are involved in the target's network environment, as well as just mapping out vendors, places where you might have exposure and risk. And then foot stomp here, it's extremely important to ask about prior breaches. So as many of you are aware with the Yahoo situation, that wasn't Yahoo's only breach. There's a number of breaches that Yahoo was involved in. And I don't know what was talked about at the M&A talks, but I think that one is one that might have been avoided. had there been more discussion or more proactive work done. And then regulatory compliance is a huge issue, depending on the vertical that the target is in. That can be provide enormous risk, and it can also provide some, there's like for PCI, there's a baseline set of security standards that are utilized for PCI called the PCI DSS. And many people think that those are, complete protection, which they are not. But if a target company is not utilizing those effectively or not adhering to those, and that can cause significant risk from a cybersecurity perspective, but it can also cause compliance or regulatory issues that then the acquirer is basically taking over. And then generally it's a good idea to do a resiliency check. And there's a specific type of assessment that gets to the heart of this called an incident response readiness assessment, or an IRRA. And this basically will rate the target's ability to withstand or to actually perform during a cyber attack. And those are great things to think of prior to the M&A. So we talked about the purposes behind it. So what are the benefits of doing an assessment pre-M&A? Well, it identifies risk and target assets. It gives you a picture of the environment before the acquisition occurs. It talks through or identifies confidentiality, integrity, and importantly, availability as well for any target assets in the environment. And then it should identify methods for short or long-term protection that are currently in place, or identify areas or gaps that can be utilized for that protection. It can show things that can affect the financial costs, similar to the YAHOO breach, which is at a massive scale. The breach costs $350 million plus. So this can identify latent issues that require financial fixes, or where financial fixes can be effective. And as well as the financial costs, there's of course the resource costs as well. We work with a number of kind of enterprise clients that do a lot of acquisitions, and we're their go-to M&A firm. And one of the things that they really value about our ability to do these assessments is that we can identify areas that are going to take not just the dollar cost, but they're going to take resource costs away from the acquiring company that are going to have to concentrate on fixing things or addressing risk on the target or acquiree. And that is invaluable in and of itself for these companies that they have a large cash flow, and their personnel resources are limited, especially in cybersecurity. We can identify through a number of different types of assessments. We can identify the effectiveness of existing security controls. We'll talk about that here shortly. And then we can review, like I said, people, processes, and technology, so the processes and policies that are in place. So I'd like to talk to you quickly about the assessment paradox. So we can do 4 major types of assessment pre-M&A. We can do a vulnerability assessment, which looks for vulnerabilities in the security stack and in the systems of the target accounts, the target company. We can do penetration testing. Both of these really, we're putting ourselves in the place of an attacker, and we're trying to test the security policies, procedures, technology in place in order to try and identify vulnerabilities or penetrate the network and the systems of the target. However, what if there's already an attacker that's been in place and is latent inside the target's environment? This is unfortunately extremely common. And for that, rather than testing the outside of the security, it's very important to test to see if there is an actual pre-existing compromise. And so we'll talk about that in a second. But the last thing that we can do is we can also do that incident response readiness assessment. So how ready is the target organization for a particular incident? So compromise assessment, this is one of Cylance's specialties, and there are a number of firms out there that offer a similar service. We concentrate on 5 information domains or 5 areas that from the bottom to the top are the most general to the most specific kinds of threats. So one of the key services as it relates to M&A on the bottom is identifying networks, hosts, and applications present on the environment. As I said before, many organizations, even those that are extremely large, have no idea of what compromises their environment, what systems are present, what perimeter protections are present. So that's one of the most basic but important things we can do. The second thing is to analyze and discover malware that's present in the environment. This is, of course, a specialty of Cylance. Through our AI and machine learning models, we do bring in our AV killer, which is called Cylance Protect, into all of our M&A assessments. And it's really effective and efficient in what it does. So rather than traditional AV, which has to have somebody see the actual malware somewhere in the user base to detect it, Cylance Protect uses artificial intelligence and machine learning to determine characteristics of malicious files and then to detect them. So it doesn't have to see something that is malicious previously in order to flag it as malicious and take action. So this is hugely important to the M&A space, especially where the target company has information or data that's valuable to, in particular, advanced threats, because we can detect latent compromise this way as one of kind of the low-hanging fruit items for us. Then we do an analysis of user account activity, and we try and do that against the general baseline of activities that would not be normal for the user accounts in question. So accounts that were active in odd or suspicious times or doing things or actions that would not normally be undertaken by an account like that account. And that can help us zoom in on malicious activity in that way. Then as we start getting to the tip of the pyramid up towards the top, we get to the things that are more important and more indicative of attacks. So many times through malware or through things that are present already on the operating system or potentially on programs, attackers will establish command and control. So they will establish their ability to return to the environment and effectuate whatever they want to do, the attack or reconnaissance or anything else in the environment through these malware or other persistence mechanisms. And then sometimes the most important single information domain that we can identify is if data has been stolen from that target or acquiree environment. And this is a key focus of the compromise assessment as well. And what we do is we look for tools that are commonly used to exfiltrate data. And we also look for evidence that prior exfiltration has occurred or is occurring. And things such as large archive files named in a suspicious way or that are stored in very specific directories are indicative of this activity going on. So many times an acquirer will want to acquire a target company due to their intellectual property. Well, wouldn't it be great for that acquirer to know if that intellectual property has all been vacuumed out by attackers previously and is therefore of lessened or no value before that acquisition occurs? That is one of the key things for a compromise assessment. And then we have the information, the incident response readiness assessment and our security engineering assessments, which we utilize specific frameworks such as the NIST cybersecurity framework to do gap analyses, looking at the people, processes, and technology, as I mentioned earlier. And specifically for the incident response readiness assessment, we review the incident response plan. And I actually led a team that performed an incident response for a large defense contractor out here on the West Coast, where quite literally the CISO had authored, I don't want to identify him, but had authored numerous media on incident response planning and was considered an expert in that field. He literally taught courses on how to create an incident response plan pre-breach. And so his organization had a fantastic IRP in place. However, the attackers raised their game to get at the things that they wanted in that target environment. And they were lockstep in with our team as we were increasing security beyond that baseline that was in the IRP. They increased their, kind of their arms race with us, and it got to the point where the attackers were, we fast-tracked the implementation of two-factor authentication, which had been on the roadmap for a number of years in this company, and in so doing, we took a major step towards thwarting the attacker. Well, the attacker saw that roll out and started registering devices for that two-factor authentication server. So they were masquerading as employees and even registering cell phones in order to try and keep their access to the network. So had we had access to the environment, even though he had the team there had a fantastic incident response plan, we might have identified some of these things that the attacker was utilizing to continue to effectuate their attack. So with that, I think we are at a point where we can do questions and answers. And so please, if you do have any questions or answers, please feel free to type them into the Q&A. And otherwise, I'm happy to take questions from the audience.
Okay, I do have one question for you. Someone has asked, what's the timing? If they're interested in doing an assessment, at what part of the M&A process should they start? And then how long does that take? How long should they expect an assessment to take? What's the average?
That's a fantastic question. So the assessment itself generally takes about 3 weeks or so. And what the process is, we would basically work with the client before our folks arrive on site. We will have a prerequisite request where the company can provide documentation and then line up certain interviews with our team for an incident response assessment. And we can set up a timetable in order to do those interviews, review those documents, et cetera. For the compromise assessment, which is one of our most popular assessments, that timing is somewhat dependent on the size of the corporation, but we actually can perform that remotely. So we can, as soon as we can get that scheduled, we can usually start the rollout. And what that looks like is we will actually roll out a few successive pieces of software, or we call them scripts. But the first phase utilizes operating systems, so Windows, Mac, Linux, commands, and it basically will collect forensic artifacts for us in a secure fashion, send that back to our headquarters, our mothership, where we can do some post-processing and do the machine learning algorithms on it. And then from there, that wide net will generally yield some systems that we want to do a deeper dive on. And in that case, we can roll out our phase 2 scripts or those more specialized scripts, which also collect forensic artifacts. They do all of the really important parts of a forensic image without having to do a full forensic image of a system, and take a few hours to run, and then they self-dissolve, which is the same thing that the first version does. And then really we do post-processing and analysis. So depending on the size of that environment, that can be anywhere from a couple of weeks to, at the largest, a few months. We did a compromise assessment for a very large enterprise client where we had 300 endpoints, and we were able to knock that out in about 2 months. So great question.
Okay, the next question I have is, once the assessment is complete, what's the best methodical approach in evolving a post-assessment?
Yeah, that's a great question. So generally, we will provide an action list for any type of assessment that we do pre-breach. So we've talked about, I think, 4 or 5 today, between the pen test, vulnerability assessment, the IRRA, incident response readiness assessment, and the compromise assessment. And each one of those, for the report, you will be provided with a list of actions to undertake. So for a pen test or vulnerability, how the test went, where were the attackers, the simulated attack successful, and what remediations you can take. For the compromise assessment, you're provided, if there's a compromise that's identified, we alert the client right away. But at the end, you're provided with a report which has critical, high, medium, and low findings, and the recommended timeline for each finding and the recommended action. So, for instance, for critical findings, we generally recommend that those should be addressed immediately, as soon as possible. And we have an outline for each finding on how to address it. And then for the IRA, the incident response readiness assessment, you're provided with both a spreadsheet which has all of the findings, as well as a final report with those recommendations on how to implement them. So, great question. Any other questions?
Okay. Yeah, I have an additional question. Do you have any advice on how to handle a partial acquisition where part of the target company remains upon closure? The main concern would be that transition period.
Ooh, that's a great question. I think that presents some unique circumstances where you really have to take into consideration that anything that would be present in a normal M&A assessment might be kind of magnified in that, because if a target company has security measures in place or procedures that may or may not be coming with them in mass, then I think you have to you have to pay even more attention to those. On the flip side, for the acquirer, I think depending on the circumstances, they can potentially take a much more active role in the planning for post-acquisition security in that instance, because it's like you're pulling only part of the acquiree to get towards, to connect up into the mothership. We have advised both, mainly the acquirers in certain instances to do a phased connection or phased roll-up of the acquiree. And in some instances, we've advised the acquirer to basically firewall the acquiree off if they decide to proceed with the acquisition. So in this particular specific instance with that partial acquisition, that might be really good advice, to keep a firewall in place, at least for a period of time while the dust kind of settles, as it were. Great questions.
Yep. I don't see any additional ones, so I think we can do some wrap-up. We'll stay on the line a little bit here, but I want to thank everybody for attending the presentation today. We know your time is valuable, and I want to send this back to Sig for any closing comments. And if you have any other questions, please, we'll stay online for about 5 minutes additional.
Yes, thanks, Teresa. And I do want to just say thank you to everybody for attending. As Teresa mentioned, your time is incredibly valuable, and I know that it's not easy sometimes to get away for these presentations. So I would ask that if you do have any other questions, if you want to you ping me one-on-one or ask any more questions, please feel free to use the email address that's on the screen right now, and I'll do my best to to address those questions. That's also a good place to ask for additional information about any of the services or technologies that I talked about today. And if you do reach out to us, we will respond as quickly as possible. So thank you all very much. And with that, we'll